Yeah. I hope you're enjoying the sunshine because it's going to rain the rest of the week. And welcome to Right to Gaze, Meditations on the Imaginary Self. I'm Mistura Allison, the founder and chief curator of Ashiko. And I'm so honored to have my right-hand woman, Himasha Weerappulige. She is a film curator and also the project manager at Ashiko and the captain that gets the ship running. And
a micropilot. She's the actual captain.
Thank you. And I'm very pleased to be joined as well by Adaeze Ihebom. She is a photographer. And then we have Alia Romagnoli and Eleonora Sabet. And yes, the whole conversation, we intentionally sort of wanted to cater on this question of portraiture and sort of the self-portraiture in particular, and the different ways it can transcend through ancestral memory. And I'll give the word to Himasha to sort of, she's going to set the vibe of what the panel is. And yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us here, despite it being also lunchtime, so we also suppose that some of you might be hungry. I see some of you eating. As you might have already figured out, the topic is of course photography, and we started from photography because we found it interesting how the three artists that come from different plural backgrounds that also intersecate Italy have elaborated photography as a tool to elaborate fiction and reality and re-establish their right to gaze. Reason why, because the invention of photography occurred at a most opportune moment for Europe's colonial powers. So we're talking about 19th century, and the first approach of photography with whatever was in the West was, of course, an anthropological perspective. It was a hierarchical approach towards the countries that were being colonized, depicting specific positionalities, depicting orientalizing, commodifying brown and black bodies. Photographers, moreover, it's important to underline that they weren't, of course, objective. They orchestrated directly or indirectly in pre or post production of the photography what the image had to convey. Also because it was calibrated to the audience and to the purpose, to the political purpose of that photography. Hence suppressing, cropping, editing, adding also props to accentuate the exoticism of the pictures. As a matter of fact, maybe some of you might be familiar with Susan Sontag and her famous writings about photography, who often mention how photography can be a violent action. And as a matter of fact, we also use words as shooting a photograph, which is an acknowledgement of the kinship of photography and violence. But of course, depending on the use that is done to it and who is photographing and why. So the objective truth in photography is, of course, like a very big epistemologic question, but the relativism is a thing we can take by for sure. Photography, hence, was not passive, and because of the inherent bias that was at the basis of the project of photography. But in this panel today, with our three wonderful artists, we see a complete overturning of this practice and a reappropriation of their bodies, but also of the bodies of their communities, of communities that were lost and that were found, that were remade. You will see in their specific practices how they base themselves on, like, they play with formalism, but also expressionism. They celebrate the controlling of power within their own pictures, and they intersecate ancestral memories, but also self-reflection on who and what they perceive themselves as. So it's a constant process of searching and recreating communities. And with that,
yeah, with that, I will give the word to Adaeze, our first speaker, who's going to present a paper. And yeah, if you want to please introduce yourself and your choice of pronouns as well. And thank you.
Hey, hello everyone. My name is Adaeze Ihebom. My pronoun is she, her. I'm a Nigerian talent artist. I'm currently working and living in London. My practice is mainly photography, and today I'll be sharing images from a project I did a while back when I did my MA, which kind of focuses on like Igbo women from like past, present, and future. So I'll go through the slides and just like present the work. And yeah, I don't know how just start. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Hi. So I just do this.
Yep.
Okay, cool. Okay, so I decided to focus on Igbo women. The series was inspired by Things Fall Apart, which is a book written by Chinua Achebe, which he traces the evolution of family identity from pre-colonial through colonial and post-colonial times. So Achebe starts from Things Fall Apart, and he talks about this character of Kunkwo, which is a very important character in his book. And I wouldn't really spoil the book, but I kind of reimagined, because obviously there's stories of male figures, but there's never stories of female figures. So I thought of using the book as a way, as a starting point to sort of like take that to narrate what would be like to have Okonkwo's female lineage from that time period. So in the book, Okonkwo has a daughter, and her name is Ezima Okonkwo. So I use her as a starting point for my series. So in this series, I performatively like explore women from various time period of time as fictional character, construct their identity through like costumes, performance, naming and dating the female characters through like a mixture of fiction and also like people that I've known or that I've never met in my life. So I start with the map of Nigeria, which is 1914, and the reason why I use the map of Nigeria just to understand how Nigeria background is. Like Nigeria, it was used to be a ex-British colony, and obviously, like we have 300 plus different languages and 300 plus different ethnic groups, which we all speak different languages, have different culture, have different religion. But specifically, I chose to focus on Igbo because that's the one I know best, and because my parents are Igbo as well. So I just thought to speak from my own experience rather than speaking for like a whole like country, which I thought it was really unrealistic. So when I was doing the project, I started doing research, and when doing my research on like looking at Igbo women, I came across images from like starting from the colonial time period, and this made me think a lot about how Igbo women were portrayed from the colonial era, and this obviously like this important documentation to understand how Igbo women used to be back in the years back. But at the same time, it was something that I felt like it was always through a colonial lens. It was always through like some like from a Western lens, and it's not through our own gaze. And the narrative of how women were like Igbo women were portrayed from that time period is always seen from the Westerners. So in a way, like it made me think of like how can I recreate these images from my own perspective, from my own experience, using my family, history and the thing and the stories I know from my background. So these are just images I just took like as a starting point from my research. And these are images that I looked at like other self-portrait artists. This is some of Cindy Sherman. Both of them self-portrait artists, but at the same time, it's not really just self-portraits. It's Cindy Sherman is known for doing this really like famous series which is called Untitled Film Stills, where she recreates herself, reimagining different personas from like different film from that time period. And Samuel Fosso is known for doing this very beautiful self-portraits, where I think at the time where during the Biafra War, he would normally send his pictures to his grandmother. I thought that was interesting just to see it as like a starting point for my reference as well. So this is the book Things Fall Apart, which is the first one is Things Fall Apart, then the second one is Arrow of God, and then the third one is No Longer It Is. So like it's like in a way Achebe uses 3 books to kind of represent like Things Fall Apart is like more pre-colonial times, Arrow of God is more colonial times, and No Longer It Is like most post-colonial times. So I use that as a starting point for my series. And here is more like sketchbook of how I created the work, of what I did, like my ideas. So I've just been going through them, like my thought process as well. Same as well, like these are books I came across when I was doing my research on how, again, thinking about how colonialism has affected Igbo women from various time periods. So I just took, when I was reading the research, I came across like testimonials from Igbo women saying that, you know, like they could not practice or they could not study specific subjects because they were women. So like made me think how colonial rules has enforced and diminished Igbo women, not like, you know, not enabling them to do what they actually really want to do. So I thought it was interesting of how like rethinking of how colonialism has actually diminished Igbo women from that time period, making them feel like second-class citizens. This is like from my sketchbook. Like these are the initial thought process I had of thinking of how I want the images to be like. Again, these are like the sketches I did over time. So it's like I love doing sketches or like having a storyboard before like actually going to the studio. And this is sketches as well. Yeah, so this is the first studio work I did. And just like thinking about how I want the pictures to be. So I thought of doing it in black and white because I thought like, oh, maybe black and white would sort of give like a more like a vintage era. And that was like the first take of the series. And then this is a studio shot that I did. I just love to show like my behind the scenes of how I work in the studio. And here we have the first one, which is Ezima Okonkwo, which I dated her 1900. The choice Ezima is from a female character in the book. Ezima is the only child of her mother. And, you know, Ikwifi, which is like Okonkwo's wife, is like the second wife to Okonkwo. And Okonkwo really loves her. Like she's considered to be a very, very beautiful woman. And Ezima, in a way, is a picture of her mom. And in a way, like, Okonkwo has a son, and he always resents his son for not being masculine enough. And in a way, like, so, there's some times in the book where Okonkwo actually wished that Ezima was a male. And he has a very sweet spot for Ezima because he really admires Ezima's like tendency of being very strong and very feminine. In fact, to the point where, like, in the book where Ezima was like, ready for marriage, she'll be in control of who's going to get married to her, and she wanted to make sure that whoever's getting married to her, like, were like strong enough or capable enough to take care of her. So in a way, I thought like it was interesting how like there's a very strong masculine figure in the book, but at the same time, Okonkwo still has a deep respect for Ezima. So I thought like that was going to be a starting point for the series of like representing the whole like series. And the next one is, I named her Maria Okonkwo. I think this is more in relation to the son Wonye. And Wonye is like the son Okonkwo's son. Okonkwo obviously has a lot of resentment towards him because he feels that Wonye is like more like ladylike. He's not like masculine enough. But at the same time in the book, Wonye then become Christian, and that became more betrayal for Okonkwo. So I felt like using that as a starting point in the character of the book for my series to somehow replicate how, like this initiation of like colonialism has started embedding into our culture. Obviously, like I'm dressed up like as a nun, but it's more like a symbolism of like how Christianity is embedded into like the Igbo culture as well, and I use that as more like to show like how like the the whole colonialism, like the whole thing has been embedded in our culture. So it's more like from the first one where you can see the female character is more like secure of herself. She's like, I would say half naked, but like she's not really like dressed modestly. Like it was just very her, to a point where she's become more all covered up or like dressing more morally, because it's now becoming more westernized in a way. So here is pictures of my grandparents. When I would do my research for my work, obviously I did have limited access to visual images. So I had to use like things I have from books, but also like images I have in my family album. I only have, in the family, we only have one family album. And that is so important because like a lot of things were lost during like the war, like in the 60s. So this is the most important album that we have, and that's the only album that we have of my grandparents and other family members. But for me, it was important just to see how my grandparents were dressed during that time period. So this is the images of my grandparents in 1940s. And there's the dress that I saw my grandmother, and I remember having a similar dress and tried to replicate it. And then I made this image here, and I named that Adanna Bridge at Okonkwo, which is 1940, in a way in conjunction to replicate how my grandmother would dress during that time period. The next one is Marianne Ginika Okonkwo, 1960s. I took, this image was more inspired from one of the female characters in Lolongatis by Chibe, where she's in love with this male character, but in a way that I won't want to spoil the book, but I will keep on. But like the love is like a forbidden love, but again, it's more in relation to that, but also in relation to how these women were more like accepting the Western culture, like the British culture, traveling out and studying, then coming back and acquiring this very English British aesthetics. And like there's like the pose was more intended, because like when I was looking at family albums, most of my aunties or family members would like normally pose like that. So I thought that to mimic that pose and to make it more like it's sort of like Renaissance era. The next one is still pictures of my grandparents. Pictures of my grandparents. So I use this as a starting point for like, it's gonna be like a visual reference for my next work. So, and which is this one, Gloria Okonkwo, 1967. The date 1967 is significantly important because that's when the start, the end of the Biafra war. So I felt like, because I'm Igbo, and within the Igbo community, like ethnic group, we were like the one that suffered most of the Biafra war because my family were affected by it. So I felt of like recreating this image in memory of family members who we've lost during the war, but also like remembering all the women who have experienced that war but have not been remembered. And I thought that I wanted to commemorate the Civil War, which happened in my family, which many people were massively involved. And I remember when trying to recreate this image, I just kind of imagined the stories that my dad would tell me of my grandmother, of how she would, go set in mouths so that they wouldn't get subscripted to the army. She would normally she even got to a point where she would even beg the priest. She went to Red Cross, so she did everything possible just to make sure that my dad and my uncle would not get subscripted to the war. So like when I remember stories like this, and then there is no day to commemorate the people that died during this war, this makes me a little bit sad. So I thought of like as a way through my art to somehow make an image as a symbol to remember the lost soul that were involved during that time period. The next one is an image of my dad. So this is like more like 1970s. So I thought of using the image of my dad as a starting point as a visual reference for my next picture, which is this one. which is Dabarechi Okonkwo 1970. And I thought it was interesting because I remember how my dad would tell me like during that time period, like there was a lot of like inspiration for the Black Panther movement, which was then brought to like Nigeria. So I thought it was interesting how all the influences were coming from outside, but never from within within Nigeria. So the next one is the image of my aunt, which I've never met. So that's my aunt, my dad's friend, and my dad. I've never met my auntie, but I've been told that I'm her reincarnation. And it's interesting because whenever I go back home to visit family members, everyone just says that I look like my aunt, and which I've never met. So when I came across that image, I just thought like it was not really scary, but in a way, I was just rethinking of how people would say like I kind of look like her, even though I've never met her. So I decided to do this image in her memory, which she died in 1981, which is, I believe 9 years after I was born. She died in a car crash. And I decided to recreate that same image from the picture that she had, that the clothing that she had in that picture, and recreate that same aesthetics, but just like to commemorate her death, even though I've never met her. But it's interesting just how I kind of reimagine myself and recreating myself through her. The next one is last two ones, which is 1981 and 1990. Oh, sorry, I made a mistake with the dates, by the way. Sorry, I can't realize. So this two is more like, the first one is 1990, and then the other one is more like 2020. So it's more like, that's more my mom. So I took a picture of my mom and decided to recreate her image. And then the last one is more me, like imagining what Ihebom will be in the future. And yeah, that's it for me. Hopefully that was good.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. And we have Alia Romagnoli next. If you could also state your preferred pronouns, that would be fab.
Hello. My name is Alia. I'm a photographer and visual artist, and I go by she or they. There we go. I grew up in Bangalore, India, and I'm half Indian and half Italian, but I'm currently based in London. And this is kind of, I guess, a mood board for the inspiration of my work, and what really inspires me. A lot of the aspects visual aspects I'm inspired by really are surrounded by my childhood and just the experiences of growing up in South India. So that often included Indian mythology, cinema, markets, architecture, fashion, clothing, and just everyday life. And these are just photos I took mostly in and around my hometown. And this is kind of just like an overview of the kind of work that I like to make. I mostly focus on fashion and portraiture, and a lot of the themes that I kind of explore range from identity, representation, South Asian stories, personal histories, and LGBTQ narratives. So there are about 3 projects that I want to share more in depth with you today. The first being self-portraits and kind of my exploration of just presenting myself in front of the camera. So as it's almost been like therapeutic. The first photo on the left was taken in 2019, and the one on the right is from 2021, and it's kind of been my way of just exploring my experiences as someone who is mixed race, queer, and plus size as well. And also, it's been a way to kind of make myself vulnerable and try to understand what I ask of the people participating in my work, and what that requires as somebody who puts themselves in front of the lens. And it's been like a nice token to see my growth over the years. I guess it's like because I like just freezing a moment in time. And the second project that I wanted to share is a series I did called Mothers and Daughters. So I was raised in a single parent household, and I was raised by my Indian mother and grandmother, and they kind of really nurtured and influenced the way I approached art and just my work in general. And so at the time I started this project, I was in London, and I was curious to see what that dynamic was like for other intergenerational matriarchal households, especially in South Asian families. And I was extremely inspired by Mughal miniature paintings, which is kind of an Indian, a traditional South Asian form of art, and that uses frames and tells stories within stories. So this series was quite experimental because it began as something that was more studio-based and very art-directed, and then turned into something that became more analog and I guess intimate as well. So I started off with a color series, and this was all shot in a studio, and then I started dabbling in cyanotypes as well. That kind of involved traveling to people's homes and being invited in, and having participants self-style and kind of shoot them in poses and ways they wanted to be shot, and allowing them to have more agency over their own presentation, but still using Mughal miniatures as inspiration. And this has been kind of an ongoing series throughout the last few years. And the last series is Bhavachitra, which is the most recent series that I did. Just at the beginning of the pandemic, I moved back to India for a couple of years, and it was kind of a project I took on over 6 months. And I took a step back from photography for over a year because I was feeling really uninspired, and I ended up around this time stumbling upon my grandmother's family albums. A lot of these albums were lost, but whatever she managed to maintain felt really special and felt like the beginning of what Bhavachitra would be. And it also gave me an opportunity to kind of turn my lens onto those closest to me, also because when I was doing the mother-daughter series, I wasn't in close contact with my family because we were in different parts of the world. So it was nice to have a little bit of input, especially during a time where I felt extremely uninspired. And that I continued my research as well for this series, and it was really influenced by the studio portrait, especially South Indian studio portraiture. And so I started interviewing people, especially the elderly Indian generation of people I knew, about their experiences visiting the photo studio, and went through their archives and just spoke to them about. It was strange because a lot of them didn't attach much importance to their own family archives, and it was something that I really wanted to know why. And I also discovered this project called the Stars series or archive. It's basically based in Tamil Nadu, which is in South India, a neighboring state to mine. I'm from Karnataka, and it takes lost family photos and takes photos that were found at photo studios that were either closing or discarding their archive, and kind of tries to create an online as well as physical archive for them, which is quite rare. I haven't really seen such a big initiative in South India specifically, and so I wanted to do a bit more primary field work. So I started talking to antique dealers and going to markets, and especially markets where they sold metal and glass and wood. And I found that the curators at Stars also did that, and kind of talked to people about why their family portraiture was so disposable, or why they thought it was disposable. And also spoke to photo studio photographers and just did more research that way. And that kind of brought me to my own series. Which is Bhavachitra, which is my book over here. It's not published, it's just I have like 2 copies. But if you'd like to have a look at it closer after the panel, please feel free to come up to me and have a look. But it basically features about over 100 families in and around my hometown, and almost 100 photographs of just people with their families or just themselves. And this is kind of a description of it. I'll read it out. So, Bhavachitra from Kannada, which is the regional language where I'm from, is translated into the presentation of the self, or portraiture. Bhava meaning inner expression, sometimes used to describe art forms without the use of words, for example, dance, and chitra meaning picture, either in relation to art, painting, or photography. The series is an exploration and interpretation of South Indian studio photography through the perspective of documenting the presentation of the self and kinship as an extension of this. And the entire series was created in my hometown, Karnataka, through the use of a traveling photo studio, and features sitters from all over the city who were keen to have their own picture captured in studio form. So it's similar to what I did in the Mother-Daughters series, where I kind of brought the photo studio to them. And just to give you a brief kind of sum up the history of the photo studio in South India, I know it won't do it justice at all, but in a couple of sentences, basically, pre the introduction of the photo studio, the Indian public was was categorized and very much photographed through the colonial lens. It was extremely ethnographic, and Christopher Pinney, who's written extensively about the South Indian photo studio, in his book Camera Indica, describes colonial photography as something that was not concerned about the individual, but rather how the public could be categorized into types, whether that be through caste, religion, or race. And what the photo studio did and what it was a symbol of freedom almost, where that gave the photographer, the Indian photographer, agency over how they wanted to present people, as well as families, how they, and allowed families to decide how they wanted to present themselves as well. So also during, I think around the 1980s, the need for the photo studio decreased. So, and you had the digital age kind of boom after that as well. So it was interesting approaching this subject because it was very evident. Modern India was very evident, especially through the influence of social media and how people use phones as a form of photography, and just the whole project as well it was really important for me to return prints or the photo to the people who participated. So depending on the generation, it was interesting because some people would want it through WhatsApp, some people wanted it through Instagram, and some people would opt for print. And I managed to return the print, return the photo to everyone who participated, which was really cool. And this is going to be so slow because they're really heavy, but these are kind of some of the images I made over the 6-month period. And yeah, there was a lot of inspiration from definitely the older photo archives that I showed, as well as you can see inspiration from like regional cinema and Bollywood, just through the drama and poses and how people wanted to see themselves, really. And I think this is the last. This is kind of an overview of some of the photos from the series. And yeah, if you'd like to have a closer look, please feel free to meet me after. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alia. And to round up this sort of very intentional, I guess, contextual setting that we sort of formatted this panel to is Eleonora Sabet. And as usual, please, your preferred pronouns as well. Thank you very much.
I miei pronomi sono she, her, they, them e parlerò in italiano durante questo panel because I'm shy.
Because you're shy. So does anyone need translation? Because I can translate roughly if needed.
I guess everyone.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Nice. Sorry. Mi chiamo Eleonora Sabet, 26 anni, faccio la fotografa freelance e principalmente mi occupo appunto di autoritratti e ricerca personale.
So her name is Eleonora Sabet, and she's 26 years old photographer.
Yeah.
Mainly deals with personal research and identity. And
Yes.
That's it. That's it.
Pronouns, I didn't say it. No, she, her, they, them.
Yes.
Shit. Ok, perfect, let's start. Ok. Quindi, allora, in questa presentazione in realtà ho cercato di tracciare un po' una linea del mio percorso fotografico, quindi dall'inizio di tutto quanto, perché in realtà io ho iniziato a fotografare fotografando me stessa. Dimmi quando fermarmi, così ti aiuto. Ok? No, ho iniziato, cioè perché sennò troppa cosa magari, che ho iniziato a fotografare appunto fotografando me stessa, e in un periodo abbastanza particolare della mia vita, un po' triste, un po' complicato più che triste, in cui appunto stavo vivendo un percorso di terapia, un sacco di cose, problemi personali in generale.
Okay.
Vai, prego.
So she'll be tracing her photographic development, basically. She started from taking pictures of herself, so self-portraiture in a very difficult time of her life, because she was going through therapy, so a phase of self-reflection as well.
Yes, thank you. E molti di questi autoritratti sono poi diventati parte del mio primo libro, che si chiama The Memory of Eesearcher, e che è un progetto che parla della relazione molto complicata che ho tuttora con mio padre.
So the first series that you're going to see comes from her first book, which is
The Memory of You Still Hurts.
yes, the memory of you still hurts. That mainly deals with about her relationship with her dad.
Yeah. Sì, quindi questi qua sono appunto, in realtà sono degli autoritratti che ho realizzato nel corso di appunto diversi anni, e una volta iniziato il lavoro cioè appunto il progetto nei confronti di mio padre, tutte queste foto sono state messe insieme, anche perché poi alla fine mi sono resa conto che molti degli autoritratti che facevo erano appunto per lui, cioè c'era questo tipo di rapporto particolare, e quindi in realtà le motivazioni principali per cui ho iniziato a fotografarmi probabilmente era anche per quello.
So she reached the point of realization where she realized that like the reason of being of her photography was because she was trying to convey something to her dad, or like you were taking pictures for him,
Yeah, sort of.
roughly, like
Yeah.
you were with him in mind,
Yes.
somehow.
Yes. E in realtà poi per collegarmi al percorso, il mio percorso personale, a un certo punto ho iniziato a chiedermi più sulle mie origini, della mia famiglia, che in realtà non mi sono mai state spiegate in maniera particolare, cioè particolarmente precisa. Quindi a un certo punto nel 2018 ho deciso di partire, sono partita e sono andata Middle East, mi sono fatta anche, cioè appunto in Egitto, perché mio nonno è nato in Egitto, però da padre siriano e madre palestinese, poi è venuto in Italia a 18 anni, e in realtà sono sempre cresciuta con il dubbio di parecchie cose, a partire dal cognome, che tutti quanti mi chiedevano come si dice, di dov'è, che cos'è, e quindi in realtà a un certo punto all'interno della mia ricerca anche personale fotografica è entrata questa cosa qua, quindi questa ricerca delle origini, sia fotografica che umana ovviamente, perché mi stavo chiedendo un sacco di cose, stavo cercando di capire perché non mi sono state dette alcune cose, perché, non lo so, perché.
So around 2018, she decided to go to seek for parts of her ancestry and roots that were never explained to her, and also to them, also like questioning why they were never explained also. So part of this trip started in 2018 in Egypt, because their dad is grandfather, sorry, is Egyptian, but comes from
half Palestine and half Syrian.
Exactly, half Palestinian, half Syrian, and that started the entire questioning about also their identity within photography.
Yeah. E dunque, sì, in realtà ho spiegato tutta questa cosa qua, nel senso che a un certo punto ho iniziato ad avere all'interno della mia vita personale anche una serie di momenti difficili per cercare di capire che cosa sono, cosa non sono, cosa rappresento, se non vado bene da una parte, qual è il mio posto, perché per esempio anche una cosa che ho sempre sentito complicata anche nei miei confronti, appunto il fatto di avere il passing di questa cosa qua, ci dover sempre giustificare not Arab enough, I don't know. Quindi è sempre stato un po' strano, perché dall'altra parte c'era anche la mia famiglia che non mi aveva mai spiegato bene tutto quanto, non so come spiegarlo, quindi non avevo il supporto da molte parti, diciamo, nel cercare di capire questa cosa qua, e in più ovviamente faccio anche parte della comunità LGBT, per non farci mancare niente, e c'è stato anche lì un periodo in cui è stato molto complicato, che in realtà a livello fotografico è quello che c'è oggi, quindi tutto questo discorso delle origini per spiegare che mentre vivevo lì, mentre ero poi in Giordania, ho iniziato questo progetto che poi non è mai andato avanti, perché sono tornata a vivere qui. Vai, grazie.
Puoi tornare indietro.
Sorry.
Okay, so part of this trip then developed into a praxis of research of their identity, which
It's perfect.
Romantic.
That was amazing.
Thank you.
So partly questioning ethnic origins, but also in light of also their identity, like as white passing. So also questioning to what extent one can be considered Arab, and why were they not also explained that they were Arab, or like why were they not linked back to their history, their geographies, and on top of that, then also questioning their personal orientation, sexual and gender orientation, which then developed into You Are My Moon, a project that was started in Jordan, in Amman, but never reached completion.
Yes.
Although we can see that it did develop.
Yeah, somehow, but not in...
They speak English, so
Look at that.
look at that.
Ok. Grazie. No, però in realtà questo progetto qui l'ho iniziato per necessità, proprio pratica, cioè emotiva, perché appunto vivendo lì ho in qualche modo da una parte trovato il balance della ricerca personale delle mie origini, ma ho dovuto per forza di cose, per la mia esperienza personale ovviamente, togliere una delle parti fondamentali di me, che è appunto la mia identità. E quindi c'è la mia identità dal punto di vista LGBT, cioè queer. E quindi ho iniziato a cercare queste coppie da fotografare, è stato abbastanza complicato, poi in realtà ce ne sono altre di foto, però ne ho messe poche. Quindi ho iniziato a cercare queste coppie e a fotografarle a casa mia, che anche lì molto strano, nel senso che è un po' complicato, cioè, alcune persone ovviamente non volevano farsi vedere, un sacco di problemi, però in quel momento lì quella era la cosa di cui sentivo di aver bisogno. Poi sono tornata a vivere in Italia e ho iniziato, cioè in qualche modo in realtà da poco, però trovo un link a livello emotivo con questo tema, il progetto che sto facendo ora, che dopo farò vedere.
So yeah, this project was developed at home, so which underlines also a very like intimate setting and a very particular setting, in the attempt also of creating like a safe space for the people that were portraited, also because we're talking about LGBTQIA+ couples that were all that they contacted in Amman during this trip. So this was the beginning of a project that didn't end with the project itself, but then developed and reflected in what they're working on right now.
Ok, piccolo appunto. Poi sono tornata appunto in Italia dopo 2 anni e mezzo via e mi sono resa conto che appunto non riuscivo a trovare delle persone con cui confrontarmi, ma anche semplicemente tipo una situazione di questo tipo, riuscire a parlare, avere un confronto reale e in qualche modo anche sentirsi ascoltati, in generale, un po' da tutti. Questa cosa qua mi mancava e non me lo aspettavo, perché ho detto sono tornata a Milano dopo 2 anni in Medio Oriente, mi aspettavo qualcosa di più. Quindi cosa è successo? Che in realtà ho incontrato Marzio e Emilio Villa, che in realtà è anche qua presente, e abbiamo deciso insieme di lanciarci in questo progetto anche ambizioso, e abbiamo fondato un collettivo di fotografi basato in Italia, però con l'ambizione di essere, ci sono anche altre persone che sono all'esterno, internazionali, ed è un collettivo di fotografi che rappresentano diverse minorities, tra cui Adaeze is part of the collective. E niente, quindi questo qua è stato una delle prime cose in realtà che ho fatto appena sono tornata a vivere in Italia.
Okay.
E niente, prego.
Okay, so once they moved back to Italy, they started like, let's say, you started using photography as a method to like reappropriate your own narrative, but of course that depends also on whether you're listened or whether also who you surround yourself with, right? Because we're talking also about a discussion of being exposed, but or connecting to the audience that you're actually speaking with. So in this case, what happened was that together with Marzio,
Yes. Emilio Villa.
They created a collective of photographers from different minority backgrounds, of which Adaeze is also part of, and started creating together.
Quasi finito. Questo qua è il progetto, almost done, ok. This one is the project, questo qua è il progetto a cui sto lavorando ora, che in realtà è iniziato a gennaio, ed è un progetto anche qua molto, non so, complicato, forse da spiegare, perché, eccoci, perfetto. In realtà questo progetto non saprei definire bene di che cosa parli, nel senso che a grandi linee posso dire parla di me, in molte sfaccettature, perché c'è appunto la parte della relazione fra me e il genere femminile, genere al quale non sento appartenere al 100%, mettiamolo così, il discorso dell'intimità con il genere femminile, perché appunto sono una persona lesbica, sono una donna lesbica, quindi in realtà c'è questa cosa qua anche a livello fotografico, nel senso che ho sempre avuto molta ansia o problemi comunque in generale nel fotografare in maniera intima le donne, probabilmente perché ho sempre avuto anche l'ansia di, non so, la paura o di sessualizzarle o anche di, non so, mostrarle in un modo che mi ha sempre messo un po' a disagio come cosa. E in realtà poi questo progetto parla anche di ricerca di affetto, tanta ricerca di affetto, è evidente, e anche di trauma dell'abbandono, quindi diciamo che questo è un po' il...
Dopo questa hai fatto.
Dopo questo abbiamo finito.
Hai risolto. Aspetta, vedo tornare indietro.
Vai, scusami, sorry.
So have you ever dreamed a day like this is their final project that started in January 2022, and it dissects different fragments of their identity or of their experiences as a non-binary lesbian person, but also as their personal emotional growth and experiences, their relationship with the female gender, and also as a photographer, which always necessarily also positions you partly external to the person that you're photographing, unless you're taking self-portraits. So trying to also understand their positionality, but also their feelings towards setting such an intimate setting for pictures. And partly this is also because of the fear of sexualizing the person that you're photographing in front. So I see a recurrent theme in like the questioning of like one's own practice and trying to deconstruct it, which is also an essential. It's an essential narrative within the storytelling that these three photographers are trying to say.
Quindi in realtà queste qua sono... In realtà ho messo parecchie foto, perché il progetto sta andando avanti e in realtà questo progetto è nato, cioè l'ho iniziato a scattare a dicembre, ma il processo... No, il processo creativo in realtà è iniziato... Il processo creativo in realtà è iniziato a dicembre, durante un periodo anche lì abbastanza brutto. Tutti i periodi brutti portano nuovi progetti, quindi speriamo, no scherzo, però in realtà è stato un periodo abbastanza brutto, perché ho preso il Covid, sono stata male, situazioni personali un po' complicate, e a un certo punto mi sono detta, ma appena torno a essere una persona che può uscire di casa, cosa voglio fare della mia fotografia? Tutto quello che mi fa paura, e quindi ho iniziato a fare questo progetto, e in realtà l'ho iniziato in maniera abbastanza compulsiva, nel senso che all'inizio facevo foto tutti i giorni per tipo 3 settimane, 2 settimane, 3, va bene. E ogni giorno scattavo un rullino a testa per ogni persona, tantissime foto, e sviluppavo subito. Era molto, non so, compulsiva come cosa, cioè questa ricerca appunto di qualsiasi cosa, affetto,
Okay.
non so, prego. Vai.
So this final project, the photos at least were taken after another hard, difficult period where they were blocked at home because of COVID, which then flourished into, I guess, a hunger, some sort of a hunger of seeking for feelings, but also for answers within the questions that were.
In realtà era anche finita la mia relazione più lunga della mia storia.
And a breakup
Quindi
was involved also in this difficult period, which then, yes, reflected into this work, into a sort of a compulsive work, because they ended up taking a lot of pictures of the people that were photographed. Yeah.
No, mi sono persa perché c'è una persona nel pubblico che conosco. No, praticamente, quindi in realtà sì, il progetto è iniziato in questo modo e piano piano mi sono resa conto durante appunto, cioè vedendo tutte le foto insieme, che queste qua sono solo una parte del progetto, perché ce ne sono tantissime per ogni persona diversa e il progetto non è ancora finito, ovviamente. Ho iniziato a vedere un pattern all'interno delle persone che fotografavo, o comunque che selezionavo, nel senso che sono tutte persone, allora, alcune le conosco, altre non le conosco, trovate tramite Instagram, cose proprio semplici così, e i pattern che ho iniziato a vedere, questa è mia sorella, una delle mie sorelle, i pattern che ho iniziato a vedere più o meno si dividono in 3 parti, o comunque 3 categorie, non so come spiegarlo, però hanno 3 caratteristiche diverse, tra cui una... alcune persone rappresentano me, cioè potrebbero potenzialmente rappresentare me, tipo, torno indietro se riesco, Nettuno, o anche Antonella, scherzavo, anche lei potrebbe in qualche modo rappresentare me, oppure, vediamo, sorry, Nettuno. Quindi ci sono alcune persone che sento che rappresentano me, in realtà Nettuno è l'unica con cui dico, cioè l'unica persona con cui dico sei tu, cioè nel senso lì sei proprio me in qualche modo, cioè c'è questa connessione particolarmente forte. E poi ci sono alcune donne che rappresentano un affetto familiare che ancora non riesco a spiegarmi sinceramente, strano, però è un tipo di affetto appunto familiare, quindi da sorella, cugina, non lo so, è tutto nella mia testa. E poi ci sono altre donne che rappresentano un possibile, non so, rapporto romantico. Cioè, in qualche modo potrebbe essere, cioè, non so, o nella mia testa o nel... Cioè, non so, molto strano come discorso, però ci sono delle persone che possono rappresentare in quel caso anche quella cosa lì, e in questo caso in realtà loro due hanno una storia ancora più, cioè un link ancora più importante in questo progetto, perché appunto quando vivevo ad Amman e stavo facendo l'altro progetto, un giorno sono tornata per le vacanze di Natale e ho cercato in tutti i modi di fotografare qualcosa che mi facesse stare bene perché stavo impazzendo, e quindi ho detto...
Che ti ricordasse quel progetto.
No, io vivevo ad Amman ed ero tornata in Italia per tipo compleanno, Natale, e ho detto devo per forza fotografare due donne, una coppia, perché sennò non ce la faccio più. E quindi ho fotografato loro due anni fa e per questo progetto le ho richiamate.
Le richiamate?
Perché dovevano essere lì per forza, perché quando stavo malissimo e sono tornata in Italia, è successo tutto, poi sono tornata a vivere in Giordania, poi sono tornata in Italia, ho detto loro due devono essere l'unica coppia del mio progetto. Quindi in questo progetto qua c'è solo una coppia e sono loro due.
Ok.
Ho detto un sacco di cose, scusami.
So what they tried to deconstruct is that within the final project they found different elements of themselves or of their experiences. Partly, some people were reminded them of themselves, like Nettuno. Some other people reminded them of their relationship, their family love and familiar relationships. This is their sister. And other photos reminded them of romantic relationships they had had in the past. And finally, there is one specific couple, which is the only couple of the project, which they felt the need of like calling back for this project because they were a very important element in the previous series of photographs that was taken in Amman, and they represented a turning point in your previous work. So you wanted to
in my life,
in your life. So they wanted to repropose them in this second chapter of the project of self-research.
Yes. E niente, questo in realtà non devo dire altro, mi sa. Queste qua sono le foto, questo è tutto.
È tutto.
Perfetto.
That's all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes, so as I mentioned earlier, it was very important for us to sort of get the artist, thank you so much for those beautiful presentations, to sort of set the context to this idea of self-portraiture and how that sort of transcends in different manners, as we've seen, whether it's through literature or sort of archival images or sort of actually personal experiences. I thought it was very interesting and important to sort of present these different layers, especially when it comes to identity. We know that it's not monolithic, right? And we really want to invite you guys to sort of join us also on this question of challenging this notion of the gaze as well. Like, so as a photographer, for instance, who is it that you're shooting for? And I'm using that very violent, you know, and what is the purpose? Because of course, in terms of the different localities as well, where you're doing it, so you all sort of, I guess, also referencing archival images in a way, right? So for instance, Adaeze, if you want, what minus the fact, of course, of sort of wanting to honor the legacy of the Biafran War, as you said earlier, sort of there isn't a day to remember those that transcended and sort of transitioned. So, but sort of what is the push of Igbo women as well?
Sorry. I think it started from obviously like growing up in a Igbo family, but also like I would also consider African family. I guess there's always a narrative from a male perspective, and women I've never actually seen or regarded in some ways. I feel like the women are always like on this background, And I feel like the stories that we hear is always from the male perspective, like, wars and all this. And when I hear anything about like women, like African women, it's always about like, like African women are strong, or African women do this and that. And I felt like, yeah, but there's no actual stories about us. There's no like, like, for example, I grew up watching Cinderella, I grew up watching like Mermaid, and just like, where is a narrative that kind of represents me in that aspect of my, like, people that look like me. And I think that's how the whole series started. It's more like recreating something that is more tangible. And I feel like maybe talking from my own experience of recreating something that's fictional, maybe people from, I don't know, other people might be inspired by that and do something a bit more similar, but looking at it from a female gaze rather than from a male gaze.
I find this sort of, I guess, desire to really use imagination as well, and because sort of through words that were written by Chinachebe sort of creates an image, right, on what these characters would look like. And what you're doing actually is sort of also quite actively archiving these as a point of reference, because you didn't have that, right? And yeah, it's just, I think it's really interesting as well how you're sort of making it up as you go.
You're playing with reality and fiction.
Yeah.
Because at the end, that's what it is also.
It's like, art. I feel like there's always like, because I remember when I was in my MA, and I remember when I was talking to my professor, and we were talking about like Snow White, the Mermaid, Cinderella, all the stories, all these like fictional stories, all the like fantastic stories that, children would like look up to. And sometimes just thinking like, oh, but there's nothing that actually, like, even though, yes, I'm Italian, but there's nothing that actually looks like me or I can relate to some ways. So I felt like, it would be like to recreate something that's fictional, but using like things that I know, like within my house, like from books. Like, for example, I know Chiwechibe's book is very popular and known everywhere in the world. So I felt like, why can't I use that as a starting point to somehow recreate something that's a bit more fictional and more like fantastical for future generation, I guess.
Which fueled though an archival research that's extremely important, right? Like, which is also the one of the main problems of our upbringing. Sometimes like there's this amnesia of experiences, visual amnesia also, because we're not given the tools or spaces to find this sort of archive. So you did a very
but I just feel like visual images are important as well. Like, obviously we hear stories, but I thought like images were important, so like people can just have an idea of what they could possibly do that. And I think we're all visual people, like in some ways we're like inspired by like images, films, like images that I think are important to us. So I thought of having that as a form of documentation, and I thought it was important. But I'm talking from my own experience,
Of course.
but in the hope that maybe people can actually relate to those images or like the stories that I might have made up.
I would like to ask how you all managed that feeling, which is a feeling that Eleonora was mentioning before, of feeling like you didn't want to, of course, the other person that you're photographing, which is like a very it's a very, very radical post-colonial thinking on your own work, which criticized your own work as well. So how did you navigate that feeling, and did you reach something? It's an open-ended question, so there's probably no answer also.
Ma quindi sulla relazione col soggetto?
Sì, cioè
Esatto.
come hai superato questa impasse che sentivi, se l'hai superata?
No, non l'ho superata.
Non l'ho superata?
No, nel
risposta.
No, nel senso che secondo me è un tipo di approccio che cioè non va via così, nel senso, cioè, io ho molta paura di essere invadente, di dar fastidio, anche perché cioè, perché devo farti le foto, cioè, perché accetti di fare delle foto, nel senso che io parto sempre dal presupposto che la relazione fra fotografo e cioè, chi fotografa e chi viene fotografato in qualche modo deve essere pari, cioè nel mio caso anche specifico, con un progetto così intimo. Stavo facendo anche questo esempio a Mistura l'altro giorno, che in realtà l'ho fotografato per questo progetto, quindi sarà bellissimo vedere queste foto, però le stavo spiegando proprio nel pratico come mi muovo, cioè le ho fatto vedere, l'ha visto come mi muovo, cioè se devo mettere dei fiori su qualcuno, io i fiori te li do in mano e te li metti te, non te li metto io i fiori, capito? Cioè, e sembrerà una cosa stupida, però secondo me è proprio un modo...
Per pareggiare il...
No, ma di partenza, nel senso che,
partenza.
perché sinceramente, cioè, se qualcuno lo facesse con me, ma anche, cioè, non tutti ovviamente, però sono una persona che ha molti limiti a livello fisico, quindi in realtà per me il contatto fisico ha un'importanza e anche cioè, non so, è importante a livello emotivo, quindi nel momento in cui sto fotografando qualcuno, per me ci deve essere una linea molto delineata, cioè precisa, in cui ti viene detto, si capisce quali sono i ruoli e cosa posso fare io, cosa non puoi fare tu, quindi, perché poi capita anche a volte il contrario, cioè che anche delle persone che fotografi, cioè a me è capitato, nel senso, cioè che diventa un po' troppo invadente la cosa, quindi in realtà non lo so, non ho ancora trovato il balance, intanto andiamo avanti.
So, traduco la risposta.
Vai.
So the answer is that there's no
Strategy.
there's no strategy, but there are ways to implement in your own praxis of and also visual analysis of like balancing the relationship between who takes a picture and who is photographed, establishing boundaries, but also allowing each person to move within those boundaries and then to position themselves. For instance, they usually like to, if there's props used, they usually like to give the props to the person that's photographed and ask that person to
Give some sort of agency.
exactly to
Right.
acquire their own agency, so that you get to represent them in the highest of their self-expression.
What I find really interesting is sort of this, I don't know if motion is the right word, but sort of recreating memories. And so, but then one thing that sort of, you're all retracing origins. We have amazing hyphenated Italians here on this panel. And how sort of, yeah, where, I mean, minus of course the visual references, but why do you think it's important to sort of transcend that ancestral knowledge or memory?
Well, for Bhavachitra specifically, I found that a lot of people either lost their family archives or didn't have access to them, especially people who would maybe move from the countryside to the city. A lot of them, didn't have the ability to keep or attach importance to it. And I think for me, I was lucky that my family kept, some of the photos, and a lot of families don't have that privilege, and I'm very aware of that as well. I think just attaching importance and having conversations, especially with everyone I worked with specifically, having one-to-one conversations about, whether they remember photos of their parents or grandparents, even if it was a single one, and kind of what their memories were associated with it, and also attaching importance to their presence now and having something physical that they can kind of they have at this moment in time, and to be able to preserve it, even if it doesn't feel important right now. The project at this moment felt special, but maybe there wasn't there. I think having a dialogue about how important that could be maybe 10 years from now or 20 years from now was something very special about just the archive in general, because the reason why I'm excited about the archive is because it was from so long ago. It was, my grandmother at a point in time. It was certain people who I don't know, their family histories at a certain point in time. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Should we get some questions from because we're not here to talk within ourselves, right? If anyone has any questions, I will pick people.
And I was wondering sort of how, those of you who work with archives, how you sort of navigate avoiding the colonial implications also of the people who are photographed. Because often these are nameless people, people who have been completely stripped of their identity and sort of implemented into a very colonial image. And I was just wondering how you sort of navigated that to portray also yourselves and other people without these implications.
Who's going to be brave on this side of this?
Well, the archives I was looking at were mostly taken by Indian photographers, and that was what was special about them. As I said, the photo studio was introduced, I think, mid-20th century, and that was kind of a shift from the colonial gaze. It was very much about, families having agency over their own image, and yeah, just Indian photographers. So what a lot of them would do, and what Eleonora was explaining, was that allowing the person to kind of explore how they want to present themselves, maybe through the use of props or clothing. That was something that a lot of studio photographers did do. So although they did have certain directions, maybe it was always up to the subjects in the photograph. And I think it was a collaboration, and that's kind of how I approach my series as well. It's very much equal. There's a lot of transparency, and I think that's what's extremely important. I don't know if I answered your question, but yeah, I guess.
Just also about the photographs of the Igbo women, I really wondered, because of course you said you later took family photographs, which of course come from a very intimate background, and then you showed those pictures of Igbo women in the beginning. And I kind of wanted to ask how you see that shift from the very sort of dehumanized to the very intimate also.
Okay, I'll try and answer. I think when I was in my research, obviously, there weren't any, Nigeria wasn't a country at that time, so we didn't have photographers. So it was images from colonial times, and that made me think a lot. But at the same time, I think just using that as a starting point to then look at family albums and just see how family members were able to commission a photographer, and then how they were able to be in control of how they want to be seen. So I thought of making justice, just recreating myself from using pre-colonial images and just recreating them, but through my own gaze, but still maintaining that same aesthetics. But obviously using stories from the Chinochibe's book, but also stories that my parents who told me about those time period, and also doing research of how Igbo women used to be at that be at that time. So sort of recreating that and just taking that that ownership of how they used to be and recreate that image. I'm not sure if I made sense. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you ever so much for taking the time to join us. I just kind of forgot to introduce what ashiko was. So I'm going to wrap up saying that. So ashiko is a platform for visual culture that nurtures research and contemporary diaspora and sort of visual practice as well. And I am just very, very grateful for this very intentional panel and for you guys online and in presence for joining us, and also to the forum. Thank you very much.
Thank you.